And we're live. Today I'm here with Nancy Giordano. So good to be with you, Nancy. It's been a while since we last spoke and really enjoyed just the pre-show chat and really excited to dive in deeper on this cool topic of, paying attention to trends and the environment we're in.
Yeah, for sure. And actually, I'll just give a shout out here. I'm in the concept lab of Chanel here in Soho in Manhattan, who have given me a private tour this morning. And I've been able to play with all the beautiful products and just get a really good understanding about the future of beauty and future of luxury and future of technology and how those all things blend together. So thanks for hosting me from here.
Yeah, for sure. And uh I gotta admit, super jealous when you were telling me about your tour and all the cool labs and awesome places you've been, because what a great source of inspiration and just, as my friend Michelle Chambers likes to say, thought fuel. Like, so and
Right.
I think that's where a lot of innovation comes from. Even though people have solved problems in other industries, it doesn't mean how do we adapt those for our own and just borrow and regenerate. And so I bet your mind is just piping full of ideas.
Well, it totally is. And about the people that you meet along the way that you want to connect to one
Yes.
another. So one of my most beautiful moments was yesterday morning when I brought the head of, like, I would call it like global exploration / innovation for Chanel, together with my friend from Microsoft Garage here in New York, Mike Pell, who runs Microsoft Garage, who then gave us a tour of the garage, with a person who's building, my buddy Mark, who's building a big, huge immersive experience in Times Square. And so the four of us had breakfast and just went, and then we went through the garage and had that same kind of experience. And then the juxtaposition then to go to give a talk, as I was saying, to one of the world's largest banks yesterday and to a bunch of real estate investors who think of things in a very much more staid and static way and aren't thinking as much about how things are changing in terms of experience and in terms of expectations and all that. They're thinking about like where to invest, but they aren't really thinking about it in terms of what we deliver in those spaces. And so there's a big, gap in understanding, I think, between those who are really at the front end and really curious to talk to people very different than themselves versus those who stay in their own kind of, I don't want to call it tunnel.
Yeah, yeah, no doubt. It's, busting outside of your lane, as I think you used the words push out, when we were chatting and exploring these edges. I think it was another word that you
Yeah.
used. And it really spoke to me because, I often talk about our facilitation summit from the perspective of, like, you might not enjoy every facilitator that speaks at the summit, but gosh, if they're not going to give you a perspective on the way you show up, you're like,
Right.
oh, I can identify myself better because I don't do that, right? It's like,
Right. Or where you get agitated. Like, what I was saying before is, I've been in all these different environments over the last 8 days, like 5 different kinds of cities and environments and experiences. And you really see yourself as to, you think you're a certain way. And all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, I'm really either aggressive here or shy here or whatever in the flow here. So I do think when we get out and we push ourselves out, we do see our own edges much more clearly, both good
yeah,
and bad.
no doubt. And, it's like the, we're all facing a lot of change. And that's, I think you and I and certainly lots of others, I think facilitators are well equipped to notice these kinds of things because our jobs are like to like lean in and design with intention and consider like what are the needs and what's, we're just seeing lots of different teams. So to kind of tap into the zeitgeist a little bit, and especially a futurist like yourself is like really tuned into these things. And you're comparing what's happening now to 2007, and I thought that was really fascinating.
Yeah, because I was saying that, so two sort of insights here. One that we discussed before, and here's a new one. But the 2007 one was the world dramatically changed in 2000, not just because of the recession, but because of all the technologies that had stacked up and became sort of advanced at that moment. The iPhone was launched, but a whole bunch of other Hadoop and some Android stuff. Kiva, became a platform that people started donating for in this really interesting way. Facebook had, I think, moved out of the dorm to a more broad way. So there were a whole bunch of convergent things that happened. So then after we got through that economic recession, people tried to generate, business the same way they had before. They ginned up their old operating system and it didn't work. There had been a zeitgeist change. And I think the same thing is now for sure happening, but we're so early into it, people can't quite see that the shape is different now. But I think the piece that is probably one of the most palpable ones is that we are looking now to have more diverse folks in the conversation. So how do we create experiences that welcome them into that, right? I was the only woman on a stage yesterday at this big bank in a room full of 90% men. And so I really give that bank credit for inviting me to be part of this experience yesterday. It really did, I think, provoke and show something a bit different. But even the environment itself, how do we make the environment more welcoming to, you know, a more diverse group of people? Because I think that's one of the big shifts that came out of this, is that we need greater inclusion in the conversation, not just for justice, but also for innovation. And so how do we make those environments more welcoming?
Yeah, you know, gosh, the two things that come to mind, it's hard to know which way to go down. But I'm gonna bring up the point you made earlier, because I think it's really pertinent, right? And based on what you're saying, and that's this notion of yeah, it's one thing to invite someone in, but it's another thing to really design with intention around their needs, their beliefs, their their lifestyle, and I think you specifically mentioned, if we're noticing there's no Muslims here, yet we're designing things that go against their beliefs and what's considered safe and acceptable for them.
Right.
Of course they're not going to show up. We can invite them all day long, but they're not going to
Right.
show up.
Right. And so then, and there was an interesting question about how much then should the experience be accommodate that or shift that, because there's also the authenticity of this experience. So what we're referring to is a retreat that was in Northern California, that's built in a very specific piece of land that has a lot of history in terms of really great human potential thinkers that came to that space with a certain way of wanting to be free with nature and free with each other. And it was a very sort of boundaryless experience. And so it would probably be a very confronting thing for people who have much more rigid structures around that. So maybe, you can say, well, then this just isn't for them. But the fact is that we're designing, this was a retreat for the architects of the future, the people who are really designing the economic and even religious systems. There was a whole conversation about being spiritual, but not religious in this conversation. So you want to have as much diversity in that conversation as possible. And interesting, the history of this place of Esalen does actually have of having more confronting people. They used to talk about having, blacks and cops together in rooms and having to work things out. So I do think we just need to find places where that psychological safety and respect in both directions can be accommodated. It's tricky. And this is going to be the work moving forward. We're going to have to just get a lot better at it, which is why your work is so important, Douglas, that you teach us how to do this better.
Well, thank you. But the thing that's like coming to my mind is this like this little thread of thought that I got hung up on a few months ago and wrote a little blog post about. And it was like this concept of like, there's like intentional exclusion and unintentional exclusion. And then, so unintentional exclusion is kind of ignorance, and that's not great. We should be, but at the same time, Maya Angelou says, do as good as you know. And when you know more, do better. But the intentional exclusion is fascinating too, because it's not always fueled by hate or or dismissiveness for another class, right? Because it may be that, to your point, for the authenticity of this gathering, we're going to be exclusive. This is an all women organization, so we're not inviting men or whatever.
Right. Yeah, and then but then at least you know it. Then you understand what you're designing for, and you have a story about that makes sense. I mean, again, we can feel good about that or not feel good about that, but we can at least know transparently about what is happening there. So I do think that that's a big part. The other thing I will say, just as an aside here too, at that retreat that was designed to be with architects, there was really a desire to go build something, to go create something. And we know that that's been percolating for a long time, but it was the sessions, and there was not enough time. It was very compressed, right? We were only there for like 36 hours. So they really would have been benefited from more expansive time. But I also was really aware of, if I had those 2-hour blocks, instead of making them 2 hours of like, a few people facilitating the conversation and a couple of people being able to pipe in, that you have like 45 minutes or an hour of this, and then you actually split it into groups of people who want to explore further versus people who want to go build a prototype. Because I think the world is being divided between those two types of ways of wanting to go deeper. And we should not assume that everyone's got one way of wanting to do it. And then it would be really interesting to bring those groups back together. So the people who had explored this concept more versus the people who built a prototype about how that could actually be made visible right here in the space that we're currently in. That was the thing that was missing, is what we said versus how people were behaving were incongruent, and so the message didn't actually get a chance to be amplified. And
that's really fascinating. I was literally talking about this very thing with the team yesterday. That there are reasons that a lot of conferences are dual track or multi-track, right? Because even though people show up with a love of this organization or this topic or this community, they show up in different ways. I'm a DevOps engineer, but so I'm coming to this DevOps conference, but maybe I'm more interested in serverless, and my friend's more interested in this, and so we have different themes, different paths we can go down, and I think often gatherings can be the same way, especially once we get over this, like what might constitute like the dinner party size. If you're getting over like 12 people or something, you start asking yourself, is everyone showing up with the same intention? They might have the same broader goal, but are they at a different maturity level on the project or whatever?
For sure, right? And we've seen some of that already in the past, where they have got like things that are levels 1, 2, 3, or to your point, if you want this kind of knowledge versus that kind of knowledge, what I'm taking is one step further and saying the way that we process the knowledge also is a differentiator. So we may have the exact same DevOps experience and both be interested in whatever, but you want to go and build the next version of whatever you want to go and see what it would be like to have a more open source version of yada yada, and actually what would it mean to have an open source experience here that would mirror what it would be like to have an open source way of building something, versus somebody else wants to understand the future of or the distinctions around or have a more intellectual kind of conversation around. I'm just saying that the modalities around, because what we were trying to solve for is that there was just a surface understanding. And so how do you go beyond a surface understanding? One is that you go to deeper exploration and you really try and understand the nuances of things. And the other is that you go start playing with it and you start to say, what would it look like in this space? And then you get to see around the
yeah, that's right. And specifically, I think my example of the conference in my pursuit of being generic kind of made it sound like it was topical. And you're right. It's about modality or how people participate or how you invite them to show up and the activities you might have them doing. And specifically, the example we saw was that it was a group of 100 people, and they were all different teams from an organization, and they were at different maturity points. Like some of the teams had already been working on this, or further along. Some of the teams were still just trying to wrap their heads around it, so they needed more of an on ramp, whereas the other teams wanted to just get deeper into the problem solving. And so, knowing that going in. You could design two different tracks, right? It's like, we'll do this together. We'll honor this need to be together and work on this, but let's. But then
the cool part about that would be then having feedback both ways, because the beginner's mind, the people who don't know as much, actually can come into it and have some really interesting insights that the old timers who think they know everything, would probably benefit from, and vice versa. So we also don't just assume that there's only just like one track up, that you go from beginning to more advanced. What we're realizing is that there's actually a circle of insight that new folks can actually bring to something, and building that in, I think would actually be really, really cool. It was just interesting. I'll just say again, for my example, was that we talked a lot about community, moving more and more to community-led things and open source things and distributed autonomous organizations and all that stuff. And yet we were in an environment in which someone else was serving us. We weren't actually communally building anything or doing anything. And I'm like, gosh, it wouldn't have been cool if we actually demonstrated this new behavior that we think is going to happen in society in this actual little community of which we were a part for even 36 hours.
Yeah,
we just brought the point home in a much more meaningful way. So that's what I'm just saying. I design things in the work that I do to truly try and mirror the behavior that I want you to walk away understanding. I want you to feel it in all of the various touch points and interactions that you have there, and not just talk to you about it, but to actually invite you into it. I was going to say confront you with it, but I think the better word is to invite you into it.
Yeah. Like we love to talk about, including everyone in the shaping of the future, rather than just, inviting them to listen. We invite them to actually shape it.
Yeah. And we're talking more about building curiosity panels too. The other thing I've moved into is not doing Q&A as much. I call it Q&C, which is question and conversation instead of question and answer. And I say that very intentionally to say, I don't have all the answers. You can't look to me for the new playbook or the new chapter in the playbook, because it doesn't exist. We have to build a set of practices that allow us to be able to explore that with confidence on our own. And so how can we do that? And part of it is about having conversations. You will appreciate at the Q&A when people came up to me after the talk yesterday, or after the talk, when people come up to you individually to ask a question, I always introduce them to each other. like, David, do you know Mary?
I love that.
And the conversation more collaboratively. And I do that very intentionally to create community, to create connection, to demonstrate a different way of being able to think. Because if you ask me a question, she's probably interested in the answer too, right? And we don't make it so exclusive. And so this one man was like, but do you think things are really going to change? Like, how are they really going to change, Nancy? He had so much skepticism. I'm like, every micro action makes a difference. I just introduced you to Mary. You now have a connection that you didn't have before. Like, that's how it happens, right? That if I don't demonstrate, if I just go up to the top and say it's about this and it's about that, and I behave the same way when I get off the stage, that the old way instead of the new way, it's not congruent. It's not meaningful. And so I'm really trying to create congruence between the behaviors that I'm encouraging people to have and the way in which I show up then throughout the entire experience.
How cool is that? The next time, it's been a while since I've been on the physical stage, but the next time I'm totally going to steal that. Like when the line forms, it's just like, okay, everyone.
We made a circle. One time I was in Miami, we did a big circle and everyone got to be in the conversation together.
That's my comfort zone too. It's just like facilitate it. That's so good.
Yes.
Oh, wow. What a great thing to end on, Nancy. I hope you enjoy your time in New York, and we'll be glad to have you back in Austin soon, and safe travels.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thanks for this time, Douglas. I always enjoy these conversations, and thank you for letting me process the experience I'm living through right now. I appreciate it.
Yeah, right.